Good Sunday morning, everyone. Wish you a happy Sunday. And I hope all of you who are watching this show and your families are safe and healthy. Welcome to all our audience on today's session on Master Speak, and thank you once again for joining us. When will life return to normal? Now, that's a big question on everyone's minds. More than 1 billion people in our country are confined to their homes. Companies have had to completely rethink their business models and how they work. These are abnormal times. The immediate health crisis is grave, and unfortunately, a resolution is long way off. Whatever normal awaits us post COVID 19, it will be a distinct new reality. So, the bigger question today is what changes will this epidemic force on business people and society, and how might we prepare for a new reality? Time to understand this near future for businesses, society, and careers. So, over the course of last week or so, we've had an engaging set of leaders, great authors, thinkers join us on Master Speak to share what they think life is going to be and what could be possible ingredients for an action plan to emerge stronger out of this crisis. But one thing is for sure that in an increasingly uncertain world that lies ahead of us, trust and innovation shall assume a lot more importance than ever before. I'm therefore thrilled to introduce our guest speaker for today, Philipp Kristian Diekhoener. Philipp is a trust futurist. Yes, I'll repeat. Philipp is a trust futurist, innovation strategist, TEDx speaker, and author of The Trust Economy, a wonderful book that I would urge all of our audience to lay their hands on as soon as you can. His work was instrumental to two Fortune 500 innovation labs and one of the Asia's fastest growing technology scale ups. Philipp works with top brands all over the world in reimagining their work in order to create truly successful and innovative cultures. He works with Fortune 500 C suites, technology disruptors on building a brighter digital future. Philipp left the corporate world in mid 2018 to focus on his work as a global keynote speaker, advisor, and writer, which has taken him to over 30 plus countries, including Bhutan and the Maldives, and across nearly all continents and a dozen sectors. Today, Philipp is with us, and we are going to talk about how to use trust and innovation to build a brighter future. Philipp, thank you very much for joining us, and welcome to Futures Generali Master Speak.
Much appreciated. Thank you. Hello, everyone. And welcome. It's nice to see that video. It's nice to hear your great intro music, and I'm curious what you and maybe the audience will throw at me. So here we go.
Yes, Philipp, and I'm sure our audience are also raring to ask these questions, and everybody is waiting to hear from you. So, Philipp, I've got in this format today, I've got a set of questions and that I'm going to ask of you, and we will build our conversation as we go along. And as our audiences will join us, I'm sure there'll be questions, and I'm going to take them up as and when I see it on my panel.
Sure.
So the first question, Philipp, to use, you're an expert on trust economy, and that's a concept which is very new for possibly a lot of our audiences. So as an expert on trust and economy, let's start with that for our audience. Tell us more about your line of work, and why did you decide to leave your corporate job and pick up this as a focus area?
Okay. It's actually quite simple. So it may not look like it necessarily, but I've always had pretty crazy ideas. And when I was younger, it was quite hard to get these ideas across. And I actually believe that every one of us has these crazy ideas that we want to make real, and somehow we have to do it. So I was struggling with that in my career in the beginning, and I worked for the family business for a while, and then I moved to Singapore, where I was involved in, quite a few different things, mostly as a guinea pig trying new things. And it eventually dawned on me that in order to do anything new, you would have to get the world to trust in something different. And so I realized that as an innovation strategist, I really needed to master this idea of trust building. And this is when I got really down and deep into that subject and ended up, being fascinated with it for years. And eventually, at some point, whilst we had achieved a lot of progress in, the different corporate environments in which I'd worked, I wanted to spread that message of how the trust economy is changing our world all around the world. And so what's really changed is that in my last year in corporate, I spent almost 150 days on the road, but pretty much only in Asia. And a year later, that became 250 and entirely global. So I'm quite glad that that happened. I'm also equally, taken aback by what's going on right now, because I've been essentially in the same place for 3 months, and it's a completely new experience, Rakesh. So that's that's pretty much the story there. The gist for you to remember, all of you, is that really trust is the foundation for all value, and basically that means also anything new, because when you want to create something new, got to convince people that there's a new source of value, that something else can also be valuable, it can also be a viable option. So trust is that really important foundation that we often ignore, but actually thinking about it and designing for it and managing for it makes us more successful.
And Philip, tell us about this. How does trust lead into innovation? How does trust
Right.
help organization become better self of themselves and leverage technology to do greater things and better things?
Okay, there's two things here. First of all, right, the aspect of trust as being an inherently social thing, ingrained in us as humans. So if I were to ask you, Rakesh, you lead people, right? I'm sure you lead a team. So if you want that team to do what you would like them to do, you probably need them to trust you, especially if what you're going to suggest to them is going to be change. Because generally, we know this, there's a lot of reasons for us why we shouldn't be engaging in change. And so when we do, it's usually because somebody that we trust is actually championing that change. So basically, the reason trust is so core to innovation, which is something that now, after I've started talking about it at length, people have started realizing, the reason this is so important is because actually you need somebody to take you into the unknown waters. And that person needs to be somebody you trust. You're simply going to do exactly the same as you've always done, unless you have the trust and courage to go a new path. And in case of, say, COVID, often that new path came about because we had no choice. And that meant actually, in order for us to sort of survive and thrive, we had to trust ourselves to do something new. But the reality is that every change is a leap of faith, and we have to trust in that leap of faith in order to take the action. And that means ultimately that trust is a sort of a representative value for capital. Because you may be surprised to hear that, but basically, that currency, as in money in all its forms, is useless if we don't have this shared universal trust in it. If I give you a dollar note and you don't trust that that's valuable, I can't pay you with it, and it becomes worthless. And the same goes for any action we do. If we don't trust in the actions we do, then we don't put any so-called capital behind them, meaning that in order for us to do anything and to behave in a certain way, we have to have that trust in that behavior first. And in fact, if you really want to go to the most fundamental level, then that means all our behaviors are essentially driven by trust, or also by distrust. And if you've ever tried to change anything or innovate anything in an organization or a team that distrusts you, you will find that that's impossible, because first of all, when people distrust, they close themselves off to others. And the second thing is it actually makes us incapable of collaborating. When we distrust others, we cannot work with them. And as you know, in innovation, the most important thing is teamwork and an interdisciplinary understanding. So if you put it all together, really, trust is the foundation that gets us to do things or to not do things. And when it comes to teams and leadership, that's sort of what actually gets us to follow a certain direction and gets us to work with others. So without those ingredients, we can forget talking about innovation, because it won't happen.
Absolutely, Philip, and I couldn't agree more with you, especially in these times when we know that the consumers are going to be tight on their budgets. They're going to be watchful of where they're spending, who they're giving their money to. Employees are going to be anxious in the current situation. Governments are trying to convince people to follow social distancing norms. So I think trust acquires a whole different meaning in current context. So Philip, you've done a lot of work with Fortune 500 companies, the big global players, so on and so forth. And I'm sure you know that's a lot of work that you have done out there. But we have a lot of audience amongst us today who are entrepreneurs or people who run small and medium enterprises. Now, they may be interested to know how can they benefit from your work in this area of trust and innovation, bearing in mind that a lot of them may not have the kind of access to capital that big companies today would have, to do really path-breaking work.
Okay, so I think what you're mentioning about the Fortune 500 versus SMEs, being German, most of our economy, in fact 80%, runs on SMEs. Our family has an SME. We're not a big firm per se. We're a classic small to medium enterprise. And yes, you're right, the reality is different. But this is exactly illustrating my point, because if you're a Fortune 500, the trust you have in the capital markets actually translates to more capital. So the link between trust and capital, and then the ability to use that to innovate, is very clear. But actually, as we know, innovation is often driven by constraints. So we realize that even though Fortune 500s technically might be more capable and resourceful in their ability to innovate, in reality, they're not necessarily the ones that will revolutionize their industry. So really, when you think about the startup hype, I would love to challenge people to tell me the difference between a startup and an SME. The only difference is that an SME has more experience, right? And a different way of maybe doing things. But essentially, there is no difference. A startup is essentially a SME in search of a repeatable, scalable business model. And actually, interestingly enough, that means the same constraints that apply to startups and SMEs ultimately can also be used to compete against the big guys, because there is a natural agility and also a greater sense of purpose that we see in those smaller enterprises for the most part. And that also means your efforts to change these organizations might be faster, and they might also actually be more effective. As a matter of fact, in a large organization, the core problem we see is that most of the time people don't know the story or they don't buy into it. So however much of a great job you do at the top in trying to communicate vision and purpose, in most organizations, that message isn't getting through, at least in most global companies. Talk to SMEs, and for the most part, because it's only a few hundred or maybe a few thousand people, or even just 2 or 3, everybody knows what the purpose and the idea behind the business is. So I think that there is an opportunity to use that level of identification with the reason for why this business is around, to actually use that as an advantage, to really remind us of what companies are there to do. Because once they are there to turn a profit, they have to have a bit of a greater mission. And I think we are seeing more than anything else that there is a huge resurgence of purpose and purpose-driven business. And this is really important because even though we're all on a budget these days and constrained by the situation, purpose is one of those few things that people actually pay for. And so this classic mindset, as an SME, I have to sort of be more cost competitive than a large organization, that needn't be necessarily the right approach, because we now live in a day and age in which people pay for companies that are willing to do the right thing. And they often pay a premium for them as well.
Yes, focus on the right things, and customers are going to reward you with their business. So we're talking to Philipp Kristian, for everybody who's just joined us a few moments back. Philipp, this is a question that gets thrown at us most often, which is that what will normal look like post COVID-19?
Right.
Will this change everything? The world has seen many crises in the past, from health crisis to economic crisis, financial crisis. What is different about this crisis that could result in sustained
all of these crises in one? That's the first thing. The second thing I want to sort of use here is that a lot of people who carry the term futurist seem to think that they know what the future brings. Let me break it to you. Nobody knows the future because it's not there yet. So all we can do is infer from what's happening right now about what will our behavior be like going forward. And there is one thing I'm seeing right now, which is that I'm seeing a lot of change in the tone in which people communicate. So if you know me a little bit better, if you have a coffee or a chai with me, you'll understand that I'm one of those people who's quite authority challenging. And I actually believe that the problem with the modern world until now has been that we've entered this age of hyperglobalism, meaning that, people no longer thought about why they traveled or why goods moved from one end to the globe in a sort of very excessive fashion. As in, all this beautiful benefit that we receive from globalism has become a bit too extreme. And we've seen the policy reaction in recent years with companies and governments pursuing a more local and more national agenda. But the reality is, if you really think about what happened in 2018 and 19 on a global development scale, that wasn't very positive. And so I see this as an opportunity now to really reset the thinking. And to sort of, what I'm seeing with the way people are interacting is that we're starting to question what of the things that we have done before are really necessary. And how can we return our businesses and our organizations to this idea that we're actually doing something that's sensible and reasonable. And so I think there are three things that we're currently seeing. One is we're learning to live with a lot less than we're used to. But interestingly enough, it's not as hard as we thought. It may be hard to stay at home or be locked down, but actually all the things that we otherwise rely on, we realize are perhaps somewhat optional. So I think the level of consumerism we will have after this might be a little bit more reflected. It might be a little bit more conscious, for lack of a better word. And therefore, it might actually continue our journey towards sustainability. The second thing that I see is that I think the world has finally learned to be nice to each other. And this is really important because this idea of globalization comes with one big problem, which is hyper competition. And as you know, competition is a zero-sum game. So when you're competing, that means if you're not losing, then somebody else is. So the reality is that competition actually destroys a lot of value. There is an abundant amount of evidence for the fact that competition, especially beyond a certain level, is actually unhealthy because what it leads to is inequality. And I think this reset in our ways of looking at the world has brought about a greater equality, as in the way we see each other. And I do think that that's very valuable because that's definitely something which we need to keep. The world has unfortunately got a very, very major skew of who benefits most from globalization at this point in time. And I think that we're starting to reflect on whether that's the right way. And I actually believe that we will be a bit more conscientious when this is over. And the third thing, I guess, is that we no longer think we're invincible. The core problem I found in the world of recent is that despite all the very dangerous things politically and economically that were happening around the world, we somehow seem to think that we were invincible. Now we realize that our healthcare system is flawed. It's not nearly as focused enough on prevention, that if we look a bit further, we might actually be entering a post-antibiotic age, meaning that on a global social scale, we're actually entering an age in which antibiotics may no longer be effective against a lot of microorganisms. And we're starting to realize with maybe, a lot of the things that are happening now, that there are several global emergency situations which are waiting to happen. But I believe that based on our experience with COVID-19, we're going to be more sensitive towards those potential threats and those potential huge events. So my hope is that this will start sharpening our awareness for all the catastrophes waiting to happen so that we can actually do something about them before they do.
Philipp, I think you're absolutely bang on there when you said that this crisis is the amalgamation of all crises that we've seen in the past. It's an incredibly complex problem that we're dealing with. It's a health issue first and foremost. It's an economic issue, then it's a business issue, then there's a political issue. And the second and the third order effects are immense. So with all such issues, what is the key thing for decision makers? What should they be keeping in mind as they try to navigate this crisis in the coming months? What should be their focus on increasingly?
I think I don't know if you've seen this article, but there was a opinion piece by Henry Kissinger, the famous politician, And his argumentation was that the world will look different after COVID-19. His main reason was that people all around the world will have perceived governments to have failed. And this is really important, because if we really look at what's been happening, then we can see that most governments have not really kept up with the digital age. Far beyond what SMEs and MNEs are doing, I think most governments are, in a lot of countries and places, still in the dark ages when it comes to digitization. And now I think everybody, and this includes governments, is being forced into agility and into a new way of working, what we commonly refer to as the future of work. So I think that what we're seeing now is that a new precedent is being set. And that new precedent is that the world is no longer, about old school and new school, about old economy and new economy, or about offline and digital. That, in the words of this one trend researcher, the world is becoming phygital, which means that it's basically physical and digital all at once. And the interesting thing is that the youngest generation now, the Gen Z, actually already sees the world as this interconnected maze of physical and digital. It's just that the rest of us haven't necessarily caught up. And so this is our opportunity and chance to do that. What does that mean concretely for a business? It means that how you deliver value to your customers and stakeholders doesn't matter. Whether that's digital or not is completely irrelevant. What matters is why you do it. And so when you focus on why you do it, you can naturally accept that there are many different ways of getting the job done. So I think there's two real important things here. One is to understand that we can now finally come on board with all the different infrastructure options we have, all the different ways in which we can connect and collaborate. But the most important thing is that we look beyond that and we actually focus on why we're doing what we're doing. And we focus on communicating that. Because that is true digitization, is forgetting about what platform or what mode you're using and just getting the job done. That's pretty much it. But there's a lot, obviously, this is not easy. So I get it. There's a lot of questions around that.
Yes, I get that too, Philip. So
I see some good questions here, actually, Rakesh. Do you want to have a look at some of those, or do we wait?
Sorry?
I've seen a few questions here. So what do we do with them? Do we tackle them now or later?
No, we'll just let the questions keep popping up, and then we will take it, because I've got some of mine. And then
I like what I'm seeing so far, so keep it up, everyone.
Yes. So keep the questions coming, guys. You are all listening to the Trust Futurist. Philipp Kristian, it's a pleasure to have him here with us today, talking about the trust economy. How can we use trust to drive innovation, to build a better future? So, Philip, people are forced to work from home, conduct their lives remotely. This specific question is for financial institutions such as ours in insurance. They've got concurrent challenges, right? You have to maintain, motivate, optimize, like you said, the workforces, while continuing to innovate and deliver value to their customers. Now, it's easy, like I said, for larger organizations, but what would be your advice to companies who possibly have not done this enough in the past, have not been so aggressive in the past? How do they raise their competitiveness now, knowing that the challenge is going to be far more steeper as they go forward? What would be your recipe for let's say, what is the tool that you have in your toolkit for these companies?
There's certainly a way to think about it. First of all, question, what happens when you do something for weeks in a row? The answer is it becomes a habit. And the reality is that nowadays, the infrastructure most companies run on is perfectly attainable by almost anybody because it's shared. No longer are we living in an age in which things like infrastructure and collaboration software is sort of, limited to one company. Nowadays, actually all of you, every one of us, we can basically build our own stack. We can make and bake our own technology stack, and with not that much expertise, we can actually digitize our entire operation. So that's number one, meaning the tools are all there, and the tools are actually significantly less expensive than they used to be. A lot of large organizations, we can expect them to spend billions of dollars on technology. Sometimes maybe even 10% or more of their actually sometimes revenue, sometimes profit. Point being is, without being fit in the numbers here, it's a lot of money. If you're an SME, you can use a lot of the available cloud options, and it's actually a lot cheaper. The reason most large companies actually have a disadvantage on the systems is because those systems are super old and technology has moved so fast. So actually, if you are late to the technology party, this might benefit you because you might get in cheaper and you might have a lot less legacy to deal with. But there is that legacy in behavior, and that legacy in behavior is being addressed right now because we're building new habits by having to work from home. And I strongly encourage you, and this is maybe more of a personal appeal, to embrace the fact that we are, because, and I know this is a simple saying, but one of my favorite Sadhguru quotes, and if you like him or not, doesn't matter, the quote is good, is the difference between heaven and hell is doing things willingly. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, meaning whether or not you want to be at home right now and you want to be working virtually right now, that's up to you. But the reality is you're going to have so much more fun doing it if you're actually doing it willingly. If you're thinking about the ways in which this can teach you something about yourself, or about the way you manage your team, or about the way you motivate the people in your organization. So whilst we can always focus on the adversity, we also must remember that every one of us and humanity at large has always found the greatest innovations in times that were tough. And so that seems to be a potential which is inbuilt in all of us, and it's just time for us to remind ourselves of it.
Great. Philip, so we've got one question from Anita. I think it's a good time for us to take that question.
Yep.
What are some of the new hotspot innovations in these times that you can see coming?
Okay, so I think in terms of like soft innovations, I think we're going to see a lot more understanding of Agile, because Agile is not about the tools, right? Agile is actually about the way you interact with others, the way you collaborate. So I think that that's basically, we're going to see a lot of soft enabling innovations. And what does that mean? That means when people start working differently, they start achieving different results. In terms of hard innovations, we are seeing a lot of focus on health tech. But the term health tech is actually somewhat misleading, because we're not talking about healthcare per se. We might be talking about this much more important but overlooked field, which is around behavior change. So the fact that all of us may benefit from something that can help us lead better lives, meaning exercise more, change our diet, be more mindful, and so on. So a lot of technology now is rightfully focusing on solving the problem that globally we haven't, because the reason we have so many issues with chronic diseases all around the world is because we live lifestyles that are unsustainable. So that's that. Other hard innovations we're seeing is, of course, in streaming and collaboration technology. Now, that's obvious, but it's important that we get a bit more innovative about what can be done, because I think this idea of a video call, it's been around for many years and people generally find it relatively standard. But now we're seeing some interesting examples of companies who are actually slightly reinventing that, or even companies who've been doing that before the crisis who are now in the limelight. So this is the sort of post-Zoom era, as in there's a company I just came across this morning. It's called Toasty.ai, and they apparently give you an interaction sort of challenge to better engage with your coworkers virtually, and I think it's a really interesting example. Other things like virtual whiteboarding, these are all kind of things that we're likely to see more innovations of. And then in terms of the big need will be in understanding how do we better manage our travel flows and goods flows globally, because trust me on this, we can't sort of spend the rest of our lives filling out forms and temperatures and all of that. There's a huge amount of bureaucracy that seems quite useless, which has become necessary in recent times. And I do find that innovations on this front will be super useful. So I'm based here in Singapore, and the government here has made some really interesting tools available, which make it a little bit easier to check into places and do contact tracing, for example. But I think these sort of near-term solutions will also be really important for all kinds of organizations. Now, if you also look at the insurance and financial services space, which is a space that I spent many years in-house in corporate, you realize there's usually a paucity of product innovation. As in, there's been some channel digitization, but there's not that much new products. But now I think there's also a time to really understand whether there is, a new approach that we can take on the way that we try and protect someone's health and financial well-being. Maybe we actually understand more now about what people really need when the going gets rough. And if you're in insurance, you know that in the end, the purpose of insurance is to have people's back when things go wrong. So I think there's an opportunity here for that industry also to rethink its role in people's lives, because if anything, people now, I think, are very well aware of the need for protection more than ever before. And so there's an opportunity also to put purpose behind that. So that is just some, but non-exhaustive list.
Yes, and I would like to just build on that, Anita, that I think this whole health tech, insurtech, and not specifically for insurtech or health tech companies, but I guess for all companies that are in these businesses today, they're getting the demand and supply all on the same platform, and therefore it's a huge opportunity for everyone to leverage technology and do amazing things for their customers.
Also,
Philipp,
Rakesh, on that note, just one, actually, this we've seen in Southeast Asia 2 big insurtechs getting their next round funding, and the problems they solve are the same problems they've always solved, which is simplifying insurance, making policies and products simple for the customer, providing an end-to-end solution, building a digitization engine that can actually help established insurers. So let's face it, now more than ever, the need for digitization is urgent. So of course, we're going to see companies that build those kinds of innovations thrive, right?
Absolutely. Philipp, there's one question that we get asked often on our show is to do with skills for future, right? And I think that's Neha's question as well that I can see on the panel. What skills do you see in demand, if this COVID situation persists and post-COVID? And I think we can break it into 2 levels.
Right.
So what skills for people who are in frontline or in the middle level, and skills for people who possibly are in more, technical functions? How would you see that changing, and how should they be better prepared?
Look, I think the first one is the ability to improvise, because, as they say, everybody has a plan till they get punched in the face. And this has globally happened now. So the question is, what do you do after that? So it's a challenge to our adaptability and flexibility. And actually, if you think of Agile as a framework, think again, because Agile is really just the ability to work with agility and to essentially, make the outcome reign over the process. It's as simple as that. So that's a skill which is important. People tend to refer this as entrepreneurship, but if somebody uses entrepreneurship as a potential skill, I'd really welcome them to explain what that means, because there are a lot of different skills involved here. You could talk about improvisation, about creativity, about, seeing the market opportunity, about generating human insights. All of these things are important. And if you want to umbrella them under entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship, that's fine. But I think in reality, it's basically just about the ability to adapt to new situations and the ability also to be more proactive than we have been in the past, meaning that proactivity is really important. I think even in the way we've managed the crisis now, it's always been very reactive. It's been about, okay, there's higher numbers, so now we increase the levels of restrictions. But what about the proactive things we're doing? This is really close to my heart, because the world has gotten far by following rules. But we all know that following rules is not enough. As in, you can follow a rule and not care about that rule whatsoever. You're just following it because you have to. But what if you do something that you actually care about? Aren't you going to be a lot better at it? This is, I think, the message, especially in challenging times, is that we actually got to be proactive about the way we do our work. We got to take initiative. Again, it links to entrepreneurship, but the most important thing about taking initiative is we must care about doing something, because if we wouldn't care, then we wouldn't take initiative, would we? So I think, the idea of adaptability and improvisation, and also the willingness to take initiative and care is very important. And then the umbrella term of entrepreneurship is, of course, a skill that's always going to be more essential. The reality here is, you can be the most creative person, the most theoretically innovative person in the world. If you don't take action, if you don't care, if you don't achieve the results, then what is it worth, right? So in the end, it's about that ability to respond to situations, but also to proact in uncertain times and actually create something valuable from that. Really, that's what matters most, I think.
Philip, what about the role of organizations here? Then you spoke of importance of trust in fostering a productive, innovative work culture. Now, recently we heard one of the doyens of the Indian IT industry who allegedly highlighted that productivity is going to be an issue if, in this work from home scenario, companies are sort of announcing that 75% of the staff will now be working from home. It's a bold move to make, but there is a question mark around productivity of the employees. So, what barriers do you think this remote working can create in building that necessary trust? And how might the organizations organize their workspace going forward to make
Actually,
remote working a reality?
I think this is a function of how much companies already trust their employees, because the more rules, the more command and control exists in the workplace. The message is ultimately that, the more that's the case, the less companies actually trust their employees. So in organizations where we have basically this 2x2, right? As a management consultant, former management consultant, I sometimes use that. High autonomy and high alignment, okay? So there are companies that have high autonomy and high alignment. Those are usually tech companies, meaning people can do their job as they please. The company trusts them to achieve the value that they are hired to do. But they also have high alignment, as in they have a shared purpose and a shared mindset. In most companies, we see low autonomy and maybe high alignment, meaning, it's a sort of military command and control culture, as in you just do as you're told. That's how the alignment is achieved. But then the result is very rigid. And in a company like that, and then the worst is obviously low autonomy and low alignment. That's ultimately then companies that haven't really figured out how to do their work effectively. But the point here is that the less autonomy and the less alignment you have, the harder remote working is going to be. Because if somebody basically relies on policing you all day as you sit in a call center or as you do what you do, then basically once you enter the home, it's going to be anarchy, because you're going to use all the freedom that suddenly you have because nobody's watching over you in the same way. And the reality is that the watching will be it'll be happening too, but the biggest mistake companies can make in those times is actually to add more rules, maybe to even track people's screen time and stuff like that. I definitely warn folks from doing that, because it actually creates a vicious cycle. It just makes things worse. Now what we have to do is, if you're a company that has low autonomy, so that isn't really used to this idea of remote working, you got to give people the freedom of making the most of it, but at the same time you got to give them some level of structure, because they're used to structure and they're used to being told what to do. So you have to find a fine balance. But for an organization that's already quite agile, this shouldn't be a problem. So actually the companies that are facing the biggest challenges with remote working are the ones that actually need to put in the most work in order to be ready for the future of work, which is kind of the future being now, right? Because the future of work is here. By virtue of this situation, it's very here and it's very real. There's just some thoughts on that.
There's a question from Rajesh Singh, Philip, and I love this question because this talks to sort of practical action plan for our audience over here. And Rajesh says that today everybody is feeling threatened, and he's referring to customers, and customers in this situation are likely to postpone their buying decision, won't entertain expenses which are not absolutely mandatory, and that's normal. So what should sellers adapt to? What should be the mantra for the salespeople? How do they embrace? How do they make the customers embrace their product and service in these times when they know that it's going to be difficult for them to shell money out of their pockets? How should they remain relevant in their lives?
It's okay. So this is a tough one, because in the end, like, what we buy is a function of how we trust, right? As in, the person and the companies and brands we trust the most are the ones that we purchase from. Now, I do think that what's happening right now is, of course, e-commerce is getting a boost, but I do also think that there's a sort of latent purchase behavior on the one hand, meaning that people will defer certain purchases for later, and they will usually come back to the people that they trusted most prior, as in there's still going to be that sense of relationships. People don't just forget about that overnight. In fact, if you've done a good job of building a relationship with one of your customers prior to this, there's a chance very well that they will remember you after this is over. And so there's a lot of ways in which I think this time is more about relationship building than it is about really selling. But at the same time, because people may be realizing that actually, they might not be needing all the things that they thought they would, there is naturally a challenge. And the challenge is that people will come out of this reformed. So then the question is not so much about what you're selling, but the question is, what needs will people still be having? The core thing, maybe you remember us talking about this briefly, is that it doesn't matter necessarily what it is that you offer, but it matters why the customer wants it and what sort of purpose it has in their life. So if you're selling razor blades, and it's a very simple example, maybe the customer buys the razor blades to shave, but essentially they do it because they want to look proper. So the idea is that, there's always a different agenda behind the face value product you buy and sell. Example for the hospitality industry, I'm a big fan of Hyatt. What Hyatt did during the crisis is that they said, oh, actually, our purpose is to care for people so that, they can be their best. That's their corporate purpose. And because they couldn't really host people in hotels anymore because of the travel restrictions, they said, look, we've actually partnered with a meditation app and we're going to make it available to you for free for a month. This to me is a great example for how a company that is driven by purpose can actually change the way it delivers value to customers to still be relevant even when times are changing. And I can guarantee you that customers have a great memory of these things, as in companies that do well by them will be remembered and will be honored in the future. And in fact, if you are as a business highly transactional, then yes, you're going to lose out now. But it also means you've never really focused on what actually mattered behind this, which is the relationship that surrounds your products that you sell or the services that you offer. And that's really important. So in the end, it goes back to the basics, focusing on relationships, understanding the purpose for why you do what you do or why you sell what you sell, and also understanding that people will ultimately remember you if you've done your job well. And if you maybe haven't, then there's a chance for you now to actually make up to that, because people may be thinking that just because there's no sales opportunity right now, that means there's no opportunity to connect. But quite the opposite is true. I think now is also a time where those that will prove most valuable will come out, the best after this.
Okay, Philip, there's a follow-up question from Rajesh, and I'm just going to broad-base this question because this is sounding very interesting to me now. Traditional organizations who are used to doing things in a different way, even if they're successful because they've been doing things in a certain way and they've got success, they're just not used to self-destruction. And we see that a lot in, let's say, a retail industry or industries that are driven by people, which are asset-heavy industries, right? They find it very difficult to shift and self-destruct. And Rajesh's question is on, print, for example. People, you said their habit will change if this persists for a long time, and then maybe people won't want to go back to something that they were used to earlier. So how should companies then? Is it a good idea for companies to take a hard look at their business models and self-destruct today, or you think self-destruction possibly is an overstatement at this stage?
I don't think self-disruption is so much of an actual thing that you do. Is you don't get up in the morning, Rakesh, and say, hey, I'm going to self-disrupt today, right? That's bollocks. As in, nobody does that. In fact, nobody goes around and says, I'm going to pull a 180. Like, we don't work that way. Humans are gradual, as in we prefer change to be gentle and evolutionary. So that means this is really just the way we describe what happens on the outside. And if a company's been very successful doing something in one certain way, that's great for them. But there is this very important saying that past success is often the greatest enemy of future success, meaning if you've always done it that way, there may well now be the time that way isn't going to work anymore. And because it's hard to see that when you've been very successful for a long time, people may forget that. So the reality is understanding what is the actual significance and utility behind what you do gives you much more flexibility than just doing things which are ultimately, ingrained in a certain way and just keep doing them that way. If you focus on what's the purpose and the sort of, the reason why people even engage with you, if you understand what they seek to achieve in the end, what is the actual outcome they want? This goes for the people that work for you, this goes for the people that buy from you, and this goes for the people that you interact with. What is their actual outcome in the end? What's their end game? When you focus on that, you start becoming less attached to the way you've always been doing things, because you realize that maybe there are new ways in which you can do what you've always done. The problem I have is with companies where there is sort of this connect between their excellence or their skills and the way that that is delivered. It's very static. And that means, if they want to be excellent, they can only do it that way. That's naturally going to be a problem in future, because technology has made us evolve faster. So if you are unable to change or adapt to that, then you will at some point get left behind. But what has happened in companies that are very successful is that they have people with a lot of ability and skill to do things the right way. And when you encourage those people to simply think somewhat differently about the work they've always done, those people can achieve extraordinary outcomes in a new way as well. Because the side effect of creating a very successful business is that you have a lot of knowledge and expertise and ability inside that business. And activating it in a new way can really transform things. And it can do so in a way where the internal transformation is more gentle, because it focuses on things that people already know, meaning it focuses on their expertise and their knowledge. But in order for you to do that, you must actually trust that the people that make your organization successful and great have something worthwhile to say. You cannot do this top down. You have to actually entrust them with the process. And then you can also make that transformation a reality.
That's very useful, Philip. I hope our audiences who are watching us, they're making notes. Actually, you don't have to make notes, because the recording of this conversation will be available post our session is over. So, Philip, let's sort of pace things forward a little bit. I'm going to ask you, it's not a rapid fire question round, but I'm going to sort of challenge you to, since you work in the area of innovation and technology so extensively, I'm going to name out industry. What I want you to do is look at 5 to 10 years ahead from now. So let's say it's 2027 or 2030, thereabouts. How do you see these industries, right? So give our viewers a visual of how do you see these industries or these sectors to be. Yeah?
Right. The disclaimer here is that I'm quite allergic to folks who predict the far future, because it's very much a finger in the air thing, but I'll gladly see what I can do with what you throw at me. So you might be getting a curveball, but I hope you're ready for it.
Fashion.
Are you back?
Talk about fashion as an industry.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear that. Fashion. Okay.
You're responding with a stump look.
3 things. First of all, current trends we're seeing, which will be reaching maturity by then. One is sustainable fashion, meaning we will care more about supply chains. We will care more about things like chemicals, environmental impact, the social conditions of how garments are made, which really is something that has been a huge topic in recent times. And this is going to reach a certain mainstream where, in the same way that we thought certain processes were unacceptable, that were okay in the past are unacceptable now, it's going to be the same with fashion, hopefully. So meaning that we are going to vastly move towards the sustainability and social sustainability angle as well. Second thing would be the idea of sharing and upcycling, meaning that the sharing economy has already made it non-stigmatized to also, buy secondhand or to share or to sell or to repurpose. We're going to see a lot more of that happening, which means the overall fashion industry may see a decline in actually new items bought. And that's a good thing, because we know how much water and pesticides are involved in making things like cotton fibers. So that's a good thing. And the third aspect is, this goes back to the idea, I think, that because our world has hyper-globalized, we might actually see a resurgence of cultural preservation efforts and identities through our clothing. There's been this phase where now everybody wears the same t-shirt all around the world, but I think we're starting to move towards an age where that idea of proudly local is actually catching on again in fashion. And we're going to see probably a lot more locally inspired and culturally imbued fashion going forward, which also means that the industry will get more distributed. And that means we will have a lot more of a decentralized power structure, which is something that's happening across a lot of industries.
Great. So travel and tourism.
Okay. So ecotourism and eco luxury are the trends that we've seen in the last years as emerging really big. The reality is the narrative has always been you build a resort somewhere, and the income from that resort will uplift the community. That's a nice story, but the reality is that it's not entirely true, and mostly there's a lot of pollution and other issues that come with it. So I think increasingly what we're going to see is ecotourism that actually deserves that name, and where it's truly integrated into an effort of, for example, maybe even planting mangroves in an area that has been deforested, or actually kind of where the tourism becomes part of the cause rather than just the bank behind the cause. So that's one thing we're seeing. Overall, I think we're going to see a lot of necessary progress in emissions, because that's unfortunately a big issue with travel overall. And I think the other part is that we might actually see the pricing intelligence behind travel and tourism change slightly. We've had a very, very massive cheapening of travel in recent years, but we're going to probably see, especially in these times now, that some airlines, some travel players will actually go out of business because of that. And so we might actually see a shift away from this hyper competition here as well. You might see a bit more of a sensible approach. I also think that there is going to be an age in which OTAs, as an online travel agents, will no longer have a valid promise to the customer, because I don't know about you, but so far I've had the biggest pain in getting my refunds for travel that I had booked before COVID from online travel agents, like the big names. And I think people will actually show their frustration and also realize that these companies are mainly engineered for profit, and they don't actually care about the hotels or the customers. So I think we might also see a slight reverse globalization movement, because ultimately for smaller hotels to survive, a lot of online travel agents are actually very dangerous, because these smaller hotels depend on their businesses. So we might also see a slight change in competitive dynamics, again, because as people, we might realize that what's been happening in the past is quite ridiculous.
Philipp, lastly, banking and insurance.
Okay, so we've seen, the focus being on fintech and insurtech, ultimately providing better customer interfaces. We can see the interface revolution being the biggest opportunity in that space as well. The second thing is simplification, meaning we're finally going to get towards products that are actually dead simple and beautiful. And thirdly, we'll see somewhat unorthodox product innovation. In Singapore here, there is this company called Singlife. They have an account that works like a bank account, also allows you to invest, and has life insurance wrapped around it. Those kinds of products are basically interesting because they compete with the products of a bank, but they're actually not a bank. So we're also going to increasingly see banks and insurance companies encroaching on each other's space and providing the sort of full service approach with a more of an API platform realization, meaning you pipe in different services from different places and you provide really nice and high quality digital interfaces. And because you do that, you can actually give people a great experience through your digital services. What we are also going to see is the death of a lot of half-baked digibanks, because not many digital banks have actually done very well. And there's a difference between building a truly great digital product and between an old company trying to look cool. And that's a very important difference, because just putting out some fancy branded so-called technology-driven bank is going to be useless if you power it with the same mainframes that have already been obsolete in the last kind of 10, 20 years. So the reality is also we're going to see a significant difference in the kinds of companies that will actually thrive in this day and age and in this space. Example, there's a startup that a friend of mine's founded in Australia. They do compliance as a service for neobanks, meaning they do all the difficult stuff, all the regulatory stuff, and they outsource that. Companies like that are pretty much the future because they actually make complex simple, and they enable a whole suite of innovation on top of that. So we can see a lot of those enabling players also propping up and making a huge racket in certain parts of the industry, and I think that's actually overall going to increase the rate of innovation. Yeah.
Super. Philip, I'm just going to go over some of the questions that I see, and I'll skip over the ones we have answered because we've got about 10 odd minutes or so with Philip. So,
Right.
Bhavik answered your question about healthcare. Okay, so there's a question around what kind of courses, training, knowledge upgrades do you think marketing professionals or teams undergo to remain relevant and competitive in these times?
Right. Okay. This only half joking. I actually teach an executive education course at Singapore Management University. You should definitely sign up for that. No, but joking. There's a very good reason why I teach this course. The reason is that this course is about corporate innovation and transformation. And as you may have realized, it's actually a pretty difficult topic. But in the near future, we can expect marketing and technology and strategy and all the different functions which used to be beautifully siloed at the top and even cascading down from that to actually increasingly become roles that sort of plug into each other and have APIs with each other in a sort of technology metaphor, meaning that the CMO and the CSO and the CIO and the CFO might actually end up working in the same office, or might actually end up working on the same projects, and might actually end up cross-pollinating. The reason this matters is because there is no such thing as a marketing discipline and a strategy discipline anymore, because the value chain is no longer in any way linear. It's not like you have a product that goes to product development, then it goes to marketing, and then it goes to distribution. That's no longer the case. So I think the biggest thing here is what we call integrative thinking, meaning the ability to look at contrasting backgrounds, perspectives, and views, and to come up with a solution that unifies both in an elegant way. This is about creativity, but it's also about being able to negotiate not a compromise, but something that makes both parties very happy and that actually, benefits from the interdisciplinarity and the diversity that we have across different functions and across the organization at large. So we're going to see marketing change from being a discipline towards being a perspective on the business. And this is really important because this goes all the way to the frontline marketeer, where you have an age of incredible noise. It's simply not practicable to just, push things out to people anymore, because the likelihood that people will listen isn't going to be that high. So I think we're going to focus back on what really matters, which is, has always mattered in human history, which is storytelling. Telling a story and actually sharing the purpose of why you as a company do what you do. Why should people believe and work with you and purchase your products and services? Why does it matter? And that message has to be simple, it has to be compelling, and it has to be more relevant than all the garbage and the fake news out there. If you want to have the best message in the world, you got to make it sound and feel and experienced best. It has to be to the customer, to the recipient, the best message out there, the best option. So the best line of defense you have against all that noise happening is just to tell the better story. And as we all know, as marketeers or as humans, communication is not what you say, it's not what you do, it's the reaction you receive from others in response, right?
That's right. Philip, previous speaker spoke of gig economy and saying something that's a reality waiting to happen, given the current. What's your view on that?
I think that the increase of options and choice can be great. And I think that we are going, apparently some people say that half of Asia will be working freelance in 2030. Now, I'm not a statistician, so I don't know how these numbers are generated, but it sounds plausible to me. And I think we're going to see basically a new type of understanding of organizations. Traditionally, an organization is nothing more than a group of people. But that group of people has been somewhat formally associated, right? Because they are all employed by the same organization. They share business cards, they share workplaces, they share a lot of things. And they share a culture, of course. In the gig economy, that culture might actually be more flexible and might be more focused on the particular project or the particular effort that you're trying to work in. So we're going to see, a lot more flexibility with people no longer necessarily having to take up employment in the classic realm, but the ability to work in different industries with different companies on different projects, and still sort of have a sense of integration and belonging with all of these. So I think that the gig economy is a huge opportunity for us to leverage, but it's also not the only way to get things done. As in, I think in the future, we're going to see a merging between the formal employment economy and the informal sector. And that merger for a lot of countries is going to be very valuable, because it means that we finally are bridging a gap between entirely different worlds that should actually be connected.
That's fair enough. Two more questions before we, how much ever I want this session to go on, but we are conscious of your time. So, Philip, this question is to do with the more global geopolitical stage, right? There are a lot of possible theories around what's going to, or how US and some of the bigger economies and EU are going to react to China, given that there's a belief that China didn't act in the best interest of the world. And there may be some sanctions or something of that sort. How do you see that as an opportunity for India? And what would be your, what would be your game plan to tackle this situation and take advantage of this situation?
So I think that the role of soft power is hugely important nowadays, because I think the ways like competitive dynamics between nations work out these days is mainly through soft power. This classic, idea of force, I think, in a world which has enjoyed peace for at least vast parts for the last decades, is no longer appealing. So soft power is important. And I know China has a take on soft power, but I don't know whether the world necessarily trusts that. And I think that's always going to be the aspect that we need to ask ourselves, because what's certainly happened in the US and China is quite profound. So we've seen that, there is always that level of, if you can't really trust either party, then who do you choose, right? You tend to choose the option that you think is maybe more beneficial towards you, or generally trust is relative, as in, even if you find both parties, both options, or all options distrustworthy, you have to choose one or the other. So I think in the end, it's going to have to come down to how the superpowers in the world evolve, and how do all the other countries evolve towards that. So a lot of these interconnected dynamics will ultimately mean that we will increasingly have a certain perception of places, and that perception will be reality. Because what you see now in the digital era is that perception and reality can no longer be easily separated. They've become one and the same thing. And this is also why I think a lot of governments are very, very careful about the kind of perception that they, and generally people as well, very careful about the kind of perception that they, that they have out there. But the reality, and this is also the problem with a lot of the world, is that people are so sick of political talk, as in this idea of a polished, manicured, written speech that has nothing to do with the reality. I think people are fed up with it. I think we want real talk more than ever. And unfortunately, the people that real talk are often populists, and they're often radical conservative populists, not necessarily the ones that we want to be real talk to. But what you must understand, and I think what I currently see in the world, is that people are so fed up of the political claptrap. They don't want messages of polished, automatic, artificial people that say things that they don't actually care about. They want passion, they want authenticity, and they want somebody to actually do as they believe, rather than to just basically, say something which sounds really like it's not their own words, and which they're only saying to stay in power. So to me, there is going to be a huge, I think, change in the way we perceive politics and we perceive soft power. And it's anyone's guess who's going to emerge victorious. But I do think that people are going to second guess a a lot more nowadays. There is legitimate question for a lot of countries whether the way they've actually handled COVID is the right way. And the net result of that inquiry and the net result of those conversations we have and the perceptions we form will put certain countries ahead of others. But I wouldn't be as bold to make economic predictions because, as you may recall, I'm saying that I actually think a lot of these predictions are very much made out of thin air, especially in a time as disruptive as the current one.
Thanks, Philip. And this brings me to the last question for the show today, Philip, and one of my favorites always. If you were to be an investor, I'm not too sure if you invest in companies or startups, which sectors would you be picking and what would you be looking for in the leadership team?
So, okay. So sectors-wise, I love this idea, what I call life design, as in the fact that companies in this age, the current age, they've given us instant gratification, They've given us Instagram and likes and stories and all of that stuff. It basically scratches our itch to be valued. But it doesn't make us better people. It just makes us antisocial and addicted to social, right? Or social media for that matter. So it doesn't actually make us better. I think the companies that will really thrive are those that are interested in making each and every one of us our best selves and that help us get there, that help us achieve those goals that otherwise we struggle to achieve. And in a leadership team, I think, the thing that people usually say most relevant is going to be that the person actually cares about the problem they're solving. And I think with startups, because startups have become so much now, increasingly becoming a mainstream option of how to build your career. There's a lot of people that are free riders or that are just doing it because it's cool. And so those organizations will simply not have the resilience that will see them through or the focus to really address the problem they're trying to solve. Because this idea, startup culture is all about flexibility and pivoting. But if you don't know what the core problem you want to solve is or what the core purpose of your organization is, then you just pivot all the way and you end up somewhere where there's not necessarily any value to be discovered. So to me, it's very important that the level of focus is geared around actually solving a problem worth solving. And I think the startup world also needs to grow up, and we need to have less of the sort of stuff that's going on around, massive funding rounds, little substance, and, questionable qualifications. We need something that's a bit more solid. So even though this sounds counterintuitive, I would probably invest in someone with eclectic experience, as in it doesn't matter whether they're older or younger, but somebody who's done a lot of different things. Because when you are involved in many different roles, you start seeing the big picture. And I think that would be a fine balance between that level of eclectic exposure and also the ability to have deep expertise, because a startup needs both. I've seen a lot of startups that are trying to tackle technical issues with zero understanding of the subject matter. They're just like, oh yeah, we have some kind of, software expertise, therefore we can just change a manufacturing industry. Not necessarily the case. So I think there's a real mix of eclectic expertise, meaning having been around the block and seeing things, but also depth. In design thinking, they call this the T profile, or I call the pipe profile. You have two areas of in-depth expertise and one area of general expertise. I generally believe you need to be an expert in probably more than one thing, because that allows you to see the connection. So long story short is there's certainly a personal level involved, as in what story do people tell, but also the substance behind the story is how important is this problem how much is it worth solving? How important is it, how much does it actually do something valuable for people? And then how sort of solid are the credentials of the people based on whether they've seen various industries and they actually in depth understand the problem that they're tackling. So that's generally my criteria.
Thank you so much, Philip, for your time. Before we wrap up the session, would you want to share with our audience today about your book, The Trust Economy? And for those of our audience who want to follow you, how is it that they can reach you and access your book?
So as Rakesh said, I have a book that's already published, which is called The Trust Economy. I also have some stuff on the works, but I'll talk about that another time. You got the gist of the conversation today. So, I'm thinking a lot about how our behavior shapes the near future. The other thing that I do regularly is I have a podcast with two of my peers. It's called Present to Future. You can find it online, Present to Future podcast. It's quite fun. It's a similar style, but very casual. We talk about how technology creates a better future. And in terms of the other thing I mentioned is I actually teach an executive education course at Singapore Management University, the SMU Academy. If you are in Singapore or happen to be, or if you want to join it virtually, you're more than welcome. It's a fascinating and fun course. So you're happy to do that too. The way to reach me is you go to my website, philippkristian.com with a K. Or you just send me a message to pk@philippkristian.com. In fact, I see a lot of questions that we haven't quite answered. So if you're willing to put those questions in an email, I'm more than happy to share my views with you. And I think you can also, of course, connect to my LinkedIn or sort of, look at my YouTube videos. I believe, Rakesh, I've shared a Linktree link. So Linktree is this wonderful, very random tool where you just have all your content in one place. So I think we can probably share that as well in the description of the recording. And then you can just kind of check out what I do and how I earn a living, and anything else you'd like to ask, you can basically just shoot me an email or a text. So that's pretty much the best way to do it, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Philip, for joining us today. It was a thrilling conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And like I said, I didn't wish for it to end, but like all good things, we have a time to keep here.
Time has really flown by, so that's great.
It was an absolutely insightful conversation. I hope all our audiences who were watching and listening to us, got what you were looking for from this conversation. For those of you who joined us a little later in the middle of the session, the recording of this conversation will be available on our LinkedIn and Facebook. And like Philip said, very interesting ideas, very thought-provoking ideas. Please reach out, get a hand on his book, The Trust Economy, and I'm sure you would love reading it. Thank you so much, Philip, for your time. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Just a quick message. We have next week on Friday, which is 8th of May, another very powerful speaker joining us, Neer Ayal, who's an author of the book called Hooked and Indestructible. Don't miss the session. I am looking forward to that, and I hope to see you guys there. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Philip. It was awesome talking to you today.
Likewise. Thanks.